happy cold Sabbath. Finally, it feels like fall as we are smack in the middle of now giving season. We ask that you remember us and our ministry. If you find some meaning in what we do, it's very easy to support us. You just go on LLUC.org, click the tab Give, and then choose Sabbath School Ministries. We love making this content for you, but we also know that there are so many responsibilities, and we want to again thank you from the bottom of our hearts for all you do as you partner with us in thoughtful conversations that center around Scripture. Today we're going to have one of those. We're going to deal with a theme that we've been talking about quite a bit throughout our quarter together, and this is the idea of belief, the prime idea around which the Gospel of John is constructed. Before we get into our conversation, we're going to ask you to join us in prayer as we invite God to be in this place. Jesus, thank you for your blessings, your love, your care for us. We just would pray that as we converse, you continue to move in the midst of those conversations, and that you inspire us to think and talk about you in ways that provide you honor and glory. For we pray in your name. Amen. Well, it's just two today. Joey, how are you today?
A little bit chilly, a little bit cold, but good otherwise. Good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little cold out there, isn't it?
Yeah. It feels like fall has finally come. We had a very extended summer. Didn't think it was ever going away. Towards the end, it was actually kind of nice. But
it was great weather. It was just great weather. Even today, I mean, I don't want to. We complain a lot, but it's actually quite sunny, and it's in the 60s, which I guess for some people still feels like summer.
Yeah, it depends on where you are.
Yes,
right?
yes.
But it's true. It's not just here in California, but it was all across the United States where they were having kind of an unseasonably warm fall. And I remember when I was back in Maryland a couple weeks ago, I got to see all the changing of the colors of the leaves because it had been warm for so long. And it finally started to get cold while it was there. So it's been an unusual summer, but that's the thing about the seasons and about God. We don't always know what to expect, and that's one of the things that makes following God exciting.
Expect the unexpected when it comes to God. Yeah. So today we talk about kind of this central theme in John. We've been talking about this idea, I think, quite a few times because it's so germane to the book itself, and this is the idea of belief, how important belief is for human beings. And the reality is there is something inherent in us which makes us, Paul Tillich, famous American 20th century theologian, says that human beings are not just homo sapiens, they're homo religious. And what Tillich is intending to convey is this idea, right, that faith comes naturally to us. We want to believe in something. So the question isn't, do we believe? Are we formed? Are we submitting to something? It's rather, who do we believe in? By what beliefs are forming us, and how are we subjecting our lives to said beliefs?
Wow. Yeah, that's a great point, that all of us are designed to have faith or believe in something. It's just a matter of what that belief is in. And I mean, in reality, it's impossible for us to live in this world without belief, because the contrast would be to question everything, right? To question everything that comes up and never have faith in anything without having empirical evidence for it. And that would be a very difficult way to live, because the reality is we can't know everything. There's no way that we can know for sure anything. So if I read in a textbook, for example, that Julius Caesar, that he reigned over the Roman Empire, and he was part of the triumvirate and then took over, and then if I don't take that on belief and I start doubting that and say, well, how do they know? I can't believe that unless I've seen it myself. That means there's so much that I can't believe in, because there's just so much that I can't know. So that's a great point, that we're not only designed for belief and faith, it's a reality of the world we live in because we can't know everything.
It's impossible to know everything. And so I think you're absolutely correct in noting that, yes, we believe in something because we are crafted or created to believe. In the same token, there's a very big difference between faith and fanaticism, and that has to do with how we believe. I think a healthy dose of skepticism is helpful and healthy in every conversation. It is, after all, René Descartes who famously quipped that I think, therefore I am. And Descartes' famous dictum comes from this idea that you have to question everything until you realize that at the base level there is an I that is questioning. So this capacity for skepticism is birthed from an individual who is actually rational and asking these questions. And then he says, okay, well, what beliefs would be the best for this individual to flourish? And strangely enough, Descartes comes out with the idea, maybe not of the Judeo-Christian God as you and I understand it, but the idea of a God, the belief in God, for at least for someone that built his life on healthy skepticism, was, in his mind at least, the best way for human beings to truly flourish.
That's really fascinating. So what he's saying is, if I'm understanding you correctly, what he's saying is that regardless of whether there is a God or not, believing in a God is helpful to humans.
Yeah, he actually goes from proving that there is an I that is questioning to proving that that I that is questioning is a rational I. So he has the capacity to reason, to then asking the question, where does this come from? To then making the logical leap to say, well, that has to come from a superior being that is rational in himself. This isn't a course on philosophy, but I do think that it's important to realize that many people the world over have recognized the unavoidability of faith, while at the same time practicing some healthy skepticism, which is important because it seems like we, when looking at the Jesus event and the ministry of Jesus on earth, we kind of ding the Jews, and by Jews I mean exactly what John means. Anyone who doesn't believe in Jesus that is from a Jewish background, we ding them because we feel that they didn't hold firm to this notion of Jesus as the culmination of all the Jewish promises. I think for them, the skepticism is welcome. I think the problem is John has spent the majority of at least the first half of his book trying to allay those fears that healthy skeptics would have had as to who Jesus is.
Yeah. You know, that's a great point, that there is, when it comes to belief, there is a balance between questioning and faith, right? That even Ellen White, in some of the quotes that were shared in this week's lesson, talks about how God doesn't ask us to believe without evidence. Like, there is evidence, but he also doesn't remove all doubt, right? So there's an understanding that there is a balance between questioning and faith, doubt and belief, right? So I guess my question for us is, what does belief look like? What does it mean to believe? And then how has your perspective of what it means to believe, has that changed over time as you've grown in your relationship with God and matured in your faith? Has that idea of belief shifted at all? Because it is fascinating, as you pointed out, that John chapter 8, where he has this conversation with these Jews, that whole conversation starts out with the fact that these are the Jews who believed in Jesus, right? But it's obvious that there are some things that they don't believe, right, and they don't completely understand, right? And some of them walk away. And so there is an idea that, yes, there is belief, but was that belief either enough, or did they lose that belief, or what's going on in this conversation in John 8 where they are questioning, and is it bad for them to question and ask Jesus these questions? Because I had this similar question when I looked at the story of Thomas, which they covered later on. Was Thomas's questioning that unreasonable, that he wanted to see and touch Jesus? Was that unreasonable? Is there an element of faith where we can question and ask those kinds of questions? I know I've laid a lot out there,
That's
but
a lot. Yes,
yeah.
that is a lot. It's a lot, but I think it's we probably should look at it maybe carefully.
Yeah.
So the problem that the Jews have clearly is that Jesus has made this statement about himself. We're back in John chapter 8 to answer the first part of your question.
Yeah.
Jesus has made a statement about himself that they are not ready to logically follow. So they're okay with Jesus performing miracles. They're okay with Jesus actually being a tool that will further a belief that they already have. So it's not that they believe in Jesus. It's that they believe in a particular God or a picture of God. And Jesus, as long as Jesus functions to further that picture, belief in him is not only okay, it is actually pursued. The moment that Jesus shifts from that picture, the moment that he starts to push the bounds of what it means to be a son of God, that's really what John chapter 8 is dealing with. What does it mean to have sonship? And for the Jews, sonship obviously is related to this Abrahamic line that they are following. For Jesus, sonship has to do with obedience. And it is that shift that they are not able to navigate, which is really fascinating, because I find that that is often what we do. So we already have a belief, whatever that belief is, and then we are going to go and try to find evidence that furthers this belief. That's not really belief. That is an agenda. And so what I think the first part of your question, if I'm remembering correctly, was what is belief for you as you've evolved and you continue growing this understanding of who God is? I think belief is never an agenda. Belief has no agenda but the truth.
Yeah.
And the truth is often surprising and often disconcerting. I think the Thomas event, and we'll talk a little more about that, I hope, in the future, is a little bit different in the way that story is structured. So whereas here the big question, John chapter 8, the big question is, what does it mean to have sonship? Is sonship something that is inherited? Or is sonship, and pardon me for the gender-exclusive language, that's how Scripture is forged, is sonship something that relates to obedience? And then, probably, if you want to take that question even a step further, what does obedience truly mean? And in John, it seems like obedience is connected to loving surrender. So that's one conversation. The Thomas conversation, I think, is a little different, because it's obvious that Thomas is seeing Jesus. And it's obvious that Thomas is excited at the prospect of there being a Jesus. What I find, or of his master resurrecting, what I find really fascinating is the way in which Thomas formulates the question. Unless I put my hands in his wounds, I will not believe. I think what Thomas is searching is a little bit different. And that has to do with, we always think of Thomas wanting to put his fingers in those wounds because he wants to believe that Jesus is truly resurrected.
Mm.
I think what Thomas is trying to ask is a deeper question that often needs to be asked, and that is a question of Christology. What does it mean to say Jesus is resurrected?
Mm.
Is it like some of the early Christian heretics who said that Jesus didn't really suffer?
Mm.
Is it this idea that this whole experience, these 3.5 years that Thomas spent with Jesus, it was really a ghost or an apparition?
Mm.
Or does resurrection mean that Jesus still carries the scars of his humanity?
Mm.
I think that's what Thomas is asking. Thomas is pushing for this deeper understanding of Christology that we often don't kind of follow because we're not really in sync with the culture. And the fact that a human being would resurrect,
Mm.
scars and all, would have been deeply challenging. It would have been outside of his understanding. So Thomas isn't really pursuing an agenda. He's trying to find out what's what.
Mm.
So I think that's the difference with belief.
Yeah.
To give a really long-winded answer to your question, I think it has to do with true belief seeks truth.
Mm.
And belief that is trying to pursue or further an agenda that is already preset is not really belief.
Yeah. Wow. That's so good. It's okay. Your answer was long-winded. My question was long-winded too. So, yeah, I love that about what you're saying about Thomas. In fact, Thomas's questioning helps us to understand Jesus' resurrection in a way that we wouldn't have if he hadn't said that.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that he wanted to touch Jesus and he got to touch Jesus tells us something about what Jesus' resurrection was like. That he wasn't a spirit, he wasn't a ghost, that he was physically there, and that he had the scars, right? He still bore the scars from. So these are details we would have missed if it weren't for some of Thomas's question. It's so fascinating because there's a lot of similarities between these two accounts in that in both the parties question something about Jesus or what Jesus said. And in both, Jesus breaks their paradigm of what they had previously believed. And yet one type of questioning led to more faith. The other type of questioning seems to lead to less faith and a walking away and a discouragement and cynicism. And what I hear you saying is that the difference is in one, the only agenda was to seek out the truth, whereas the other was to question, to protect an agenda, to protect a belief, to not allow God to break the paradigm and the reality is, it doesn't matter what side of the theological spectrum that we are. We do have a tendency, like you said, to cling to a particular view of God and have faith in a particular view of God more than we do to God himself. And I say that because I've heard people say at times, and I've said things at times like this, where someone will say, well, if God is like that, then I can't believe in him, right? And to a certain extent, that's valid. Like if God is a dictator who kills people, I definitely don't want to follow him. But the question is God bound by our perspective of who God should be, or is God bigger than that? Because it seems like what we see throughout the book of John and throughout the Bible is that God seems to continue to break our perspective of who we think God should be. And it's easy for us to point to them and say, well, their thoughts about who God should be were definitely wrong. I would never believe that. But in our time and place, in our space, are there times when God is trying to break our perspective of who God should be? And how comfortable are we with that?
And it's really uncomfortable because you've invested things in a particular belief system. To build a belief system takes effort. It takes faith. It also takes a risk. We create these belief systems because these belief systems help us in navigating the world, which is an increasingly complex experience as you get older. And so our belief systems kind of help us to make sense of the world. I think in the West, we often, when we think of and talk about belief, one of the things that we do that is maybe not as helpful is we've equated belief with intellectual assent. So to believe means that you've analyzed the evidence presented before you and you've made a decision. I think when Scripture talks about belief, even the New Testament, belief isn't merely an intellectual assent. There's some, obviously, there's part of the intellectual process that is stirred when you're attempting to set out on this journey of faith. This is why John writes his gospel the way he does. But really, the crux of the matter is that belief requires something more. It requires a reaction. What does this belief cause you to do, and how does this belief cause you to live? And I think that's the part that we even today have difficulty navigating. It's not so much that I believe or not believe that there is a God out there. If we are to believe the statistics, that's still held by close to 2/3 of people in America. So the idea that there is a God isn't really paradigm shattering, at least not yet. Maybe in a couple years it will be. But the real question is, how does this belief impact the way that we live? So for example, just picking up the thread from John, it says that the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And if we take that to be seriously, I love some other translations that say the Word tabernacled among us. So now we're not just asking about a God. We're asking about a God who lives in our midst. And we're asking about a God who lives in our midst, and living in our midst has chosen to purposefully come as a son to an unwed mother who has to emigrate to Egypt, who's pursued by the powers that be, who's murdered by the state. These facts are undisputable. This is who Jesus is. And then this same son who was born to an unwed teenage mom in poverty in a backwater town, who's pursued by the system, who is forced to live as an immigrant in Egypt, and who's murdered by both the religious and the political authorities. This man says that by this thing they will know, the world will know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. Does my belief in God impact the way that I treat those who most closely resemble who Jesus was while he was on earth? The sons of unwed teenage mothers who are from a lower socioeconomic class than I am, who are persecuted, who are immigrants. Do I love them in the way that Jesus has caused me to love? This is belief. So it's not the intellectual assent that Jesus is, that there is a God, or that even for Christians that Jesus is God. It's the paradigm shift. Is that this belief has to cause me to do some things, and those things are not always comfortable.
Yeah, that's a great point. that belief is not just mental assent, that it actually changes the way that we live and the way that we see the world around us. Which is why people push back so hard, right? Because there is a loss. If it was just mental assent, oh yeah, Jesus, that's a great idea, it wouldn't bother people as much. The reason why it bothers these people is when he talks about sonship, when he talks about what it means to be a child of Abraham, and that the fact that he's greater than Abraham, it goes to the core of their identity as Jews, right? And what he's talking about is more than you just saying that you are a child of Abraham and that is enough. You actually need to accept this truth, the truth which is me, right? It's not just a concept. It's an identity. It's a person that you follow. And he's saying that if you accepting me and following me, that shows you are true children of God. And that was a difficult thing for them to accept, because their whole paradigm of who's in and who's out and who's good and who's bad is based on this idea of, well, we are children of Abraham. We're in this line. We're good. And Jesus is shattering that. And that rocks to the core of who they think they are. And that's a struggle for them. And like you said, that's what belief should do, is if we're really believing and following Jesus, it should at times shatter our paradigms of what we think of our identity and our purpose in life is.
And it's difficult to say how to do this. I'm hearing you talk, Joey, and I'm thinking, the reason they want to stone him is because he says, we're back in John chapter 8, by the way. He says, before Abraham was, ego eimi, I am. And in this moment, this is as clear a statement of Jesus's divinity as you will find in all of the New Testament. Ego eimi, I am. Hearkening back, right, to Exodus. I am who I am. I wonder if we would hear theological pronouncements that sound heretical to us. I wonder if we don't react in the same way.
Yeah.
I know the church has reacted in the same way for as long as there's been a church, right? When there's heresy, we feel, as faithful followers of Christ, we feel that it's our job to protect orthodoxy and stamp out heresy. So, I'm not sure I would have had that much of a different reaction until I realized that the issue isn't for me to protect orthodoxy anymore. So that's not what faith does. Faith actually allows for God to be a big enough God that God doesn't need me protecting him or defending him. My job isn't then to protect orthodoxy. My job is to seek truth wherever truth may lead me. And I think that's where Adventism and Adventists have such a beautiful and such a powerful legacy to the Christian world. When Ellen White says that there is no wisdom to the belief that there is no further light to be found, and that time will not transform error into truth or vice versa, and that truth can afford to be fair. These ideas that we follow the statement, heretical as it may be, to its final logical conclusion. And through this process, and this is why, again, logic is important to the process. And if the process yields that which we used to hold as orthodox is no longer orthodox, then we break the paradigm.
Yeah. Wow. That's very powerful, because it is often our commitment to the orthodoxy to lack of a better term, this idea of what we believe should be right, the thing that we're committed to, sometimes more than we're even committed to following God, right? The thing that we think encapsulates all of who God is and could never ever be wrong. That the thing that, so our commitment to that sometimes drives us to do terrible things in the name of God. I mean, that's what happens in the story of Jesus' crucifixion, right? That we touched on in this lesson as well, with Pilate and the Jewish leaders demanding for Jesus' death. They do that because they are protecting something. I mean, Caiaphas comes out and says it himself, like, it's better for one man to die, right? And what he's protecting is a system. He believes that this system of belief, this system of practice is so important that I'm willing to kill somebody in order to protect it. It's worth somebody being killed, even though I know that the crime isn't actually what we're saying it is. He's not really, Jesus in no way is trying to condone like a rebellion against the Roman Empire. In fact, that is one of the things that his followers get frustrated about him, because he's very clear that that's not why he's come, right? To the point where Pilate himself recognizes that. It's like, no, this guy is not, he's not leading a rebellion against the Roman Empire. They are making this stuff up. They're willing to do that, even though they know that that's not true. They're willing to do that to get rid of Jesus because they believe it's so important to protect this belief system, to protect this religion, this practice, whatever you want to call it, this orthodoxy. And I think that's a scary place for us to go because, like you said, God can protect himself. He never needs us to go that far to do things that God himself would not do to protect the name of God or protect what we believe is truth, right? And so that's a challenging thing because it seems like that is our human impulse to go that far and say, this whatever it is that's coming is an existential threat, and so it justifies any means necessary for us to challenge and destroy it. And we in the Adventist Church at times have done that too. Maybe not murdered somebody, but definitely murdered characters, murdered careers and reputations in order to protect what we think is like that needs to be protected, a system that needs to be protected.
So much good stuff there that we have to chew on thoughtfully. I think one of the things that stuck out to me as you were speaking was kind of this idea of Caiaphas being very pragmatic. Pragmatism is something that we look for in our leaders. And it seems, at least in this story, that Caiaphas's pragmatism causes him to act in a way that not only violates what we think the story is about, because this is ultimately our story, but also violates Caiaphas's own belief system. Which is fascinating to me, the fact that our penchant for pragmatism sometimes causes us to sacrifice even these beliefs that we hold really near and dear to us in the protection of a system. The second thing that really just stuck with me as you were talking about is that it is Caiaphas, it is the church who asks for Barabbas. It isn't the state. It's not Rome who gives them Barabbas. It is the church. And I think often when we, as people for whom faith kind of is at the top of our hierarchy, existential hierarchy, I think we often look around and we not only betray what we believe, but we do so in a way in which the orthodoxy that we so desire to protect
Mm.
can never ever be recuperated.
Mm.
The means, because the means, pragmatism says the means justify the end. The end justifies the means.
Mm-hmm.
The church's approach, where the ends are justified by the means, because it is an approach where we ask for Barabbas often.
Mm.
The ends are discarded, powerful as the ends might be,
Mm-hmm.
true as the ends might be. If the way in which we get to those ends is devoid of authenticity, logic, love, compassion, then the belief ceases to be powerful, meaning, challenging, worth having.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because if the only way to get to the ends that we believe are true is by using means that are against the principles of God, maybe the ends are wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that is not God's way. And I just contrast what happens here with the crucifixion of Jesus and with what Caiaphas said to what Gamaliel says in when they encounter John and Peter, right? And he says, well, if this thing is not of God, then it'll die on its own. If it is of God, then who are we to stop it, right? That kind of approach seems a lot more, and maybe later on the Sanhedrin looked at that and said, man, we should have nipped this in the bud when we had a chance, right? That was bad advice. But from the perspective of history and perspective of God, I mean, we would say that was the right approach, because who were they to stand in the way of the movement of God, of what God was trying to do, right? And if it is of God, then it needs to flourish. Now that Christianity is not the fledgling religion that it was at that point, or the fledgling movement that it was in that point, are there times that we look and we see these fledgling movements out there, and we have a choice between approaching it the way that Caiaphas did or the way that Gamaliel did? We have a choice. Do we say, hey, if this is of God, then who are we to stand in the way? If it's not of God, it's going to die out. Or do we say, hey, we need to do whatever we can to stop it, because if we don't, it's going to destroy us? Which is the approach that we take now that we are the ones that have that kind of position?
That is such a key question. I love Gamaliel. I love his pragmatism, because it's also pragmatism. I don't know if I would subscribe to that approach all the time, which is why belief is something that is tricky. I think there are times when people of faith and people for whom dignity and morality are important, I think there are times when we have to intervene. I think this passivity and this just sitting back and watching, in some cases, is dangerous. I also think that Caiaphas's approach is equally dangerous. So perhaps the question is less about finding the approach that we can superimpose to any situation, and perhaps the approach is more centered around how does Gamaliel and how does Caiaphas arrive at their own decisions? What mental model are they both using that leads them to the particular statements that they make? Perhaps that's the question that we need to explore.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I struggle with, because as an administrator, we're both in roles in leadership. this is not just a theoretical question, right? There are times when things happen that we have to address. And there are times when people either behave in ways or teach things that make us uncomfortable. And the question is, how do we handle those types of situations? And I agree with you. I think there are times that we have to intervene and speak up. My struggle with Caiaphas' way of intervening was that he was willing to break the law and break even what he knew was to be right in order to stop this movement. And that, I think, is a very dangerous. I mean, it's one thing to intervene. It's another thing to say, well, I'm going to suspend what I believe is right because this thing is that important that I'm willing to do something that that I wouldn't normally do in order to stop it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very dangerous space to enter into.
And the fact is that there's going to be competing beliefs all the time.
Yeah.
That because life is complex, sometimes even more complex than we can have in a 7-day lesson. I mean, you're talking about blessed are those who believe, and belief is such a complex thing. I think the Bonhoeffer approach is one that I like. So Bonhoeffer is semi-pragmatic, semi-interventionist. He believes that participating in an attempt to assassinate Hitler is a bad thing. He believes he's sinning, and he is willing to bear the brunt of the consequences of that sin. And I think that's the difference between all of them. I think when it comes to beliefs that will bless you, these are beliefs that you have that will drive decisions that you will in the end be willing to stand by and to bear the consequences, whatever those consequences might be. And we might get it wrong.
Yeah.
We might get it wrong. You do administration, I do theology, and in both areas we might get it wrong. Like, you might make a decision that impacts people. You've prayed and you've studied and you've analyzed.
Not might, will.
You might make a decision that will be pernicious to people.
Yeah.
I might read every single book and come out with an idea that is not only wrong, it's hurtful. But I think the heart that we are employing when making these decisions, which is a heart that is moldable, that is at least as far as we can, we're not trying to further our own agendas. I think that leaves me at least with the capacity to say, I take responsibility for the choices and the decisions and the beliefs I have. B, I'm willing to face the consequences. And C, I will be quick to ask for forgiveness when I make decisions that impact people negatively. So I think, yes, we make mistakes based on the beliefs that we have. Are we willing to stand by the consequences of said beliefs?
Yeah, that's powerful. Yeah. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he is very challenging for me. He is paradigm breaking for me because of how much I respect him as a theologian, as a person. I don't ascribe to everything that he's written, but there is a lot of good in what he's written. And who can doubt his willingness to even place his eternal salvation on the line because he believed so firmly that he needed to stop someone who was destroying destroying so many lives, right? That the Jews that he, I mean, the whole movement that was happening in Nazi Germany and how it spread across Europe, he believed that it was evil enough that he was willing to go to these extreme lengths, which he didn't believe that murder was okay, but he was willing to do that in order to stop him. Man, and yet, like you were saying, he also accepted the consequences of what would come from that and say, hey, if that's what it means that my eternal salvation is in question, I'm willing to do that. That, wow, it reminds me a lot of what Moses said when he stood in between the gap.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, when the Israelites, the golden calf and Exodus 32, and then God is saying, I'm going to destroy them and move on, and just with you and your family, he says, hey, if you're going to destroy them, destroy me too. That takes a lot of courage. That takes a lot of integrity. And if someone is willing to be that, if that is their motivation, man, who can doubt their sincerity and their love for other people? So he is paradigm shifting for me, because in most cases I would say, if you know that murder is wrong, that should never be a method to accomplish God's means. And yet there stands Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he challenges me. So yeah, that is a difficult question.
Yeah, I think Bonhoeffer would say that because Bonhoeffer believes in a God that is far more gracious than the one I believe in. I think Bonhoeffer would say to murder Hitler does not achieve God's plan. Ultimately, Bonhoeffer's agony is that he believes that Hitler is a son of God. And so I think he would say that's not achieving God's plan. This is not something that will honor God. This is something that's going to cost me my eternal life. And it is something I have to do for conscience sake. And I think that takes faith.
Yeah.
So yeah, it takes courage. It takes all of the things that we've been taught. But that type of belief that is unshakable in the value and the dignity of others, beyond my own value and dignity, that is what Niebuhr calls the apex of Christianity. It is this place that I completely concur is paradigm breaking and disrupting, because it's a place that very few people get to. Bonhoeffer for me is one of the few people, I count them on the fingers of my hands, that I've looked at in the history of humankind, and I can say they've really achieved this higher level of faith development and spirituality. Because they are able, or he was able, to say, I hold this belief so firmly that I cannot live life any other way. And the belief was actually very simple. It was, like we said, Niebuhr's apex of Christianity, which is to love others more than I love myself.
Yeah.
That's the one belief I think that is unshakable. And however that needs to be preserved. Luckily, I don't have to worry about that because I'm not at that level of spiritual development. But I think that's the goal.
Yeah. And I love how you bring up this element of faith development, because those who have studied faith and the journey of faith have noted that it's not just a matter of mental assent. I mean, that's where it begins, where you say, hey, there is something bigger than me out here. I don't understand it. I don't know it completely, but there is something that is bigger than me. And it starts there, but it doesn't end there. There's a development of that faith, and it goes through, like, I love the critical, they call it the critical journey. Janet, I forget her last name. I think I wrote it here. Hagberg. She talks about how there's these 6 stages of faith, and it starts with that openness of God, moves to being learning about God and being committed to, like you've talked, a certain paradigm of who God is, and you find that so enriching and so beautiful that you commit to it. And then that moves to now I want to work for God because God is this beautiful being. I want to serve him in the world. And a lot of people, that's the stage that they stop.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where faith stops, because what happens after that is what they call the wall, what she calls the wall. And the wall is, man, that framework that I was committed to, it doesn't fit what I'm seeing in my life and in the world around me. And for many people, that's where that crisis of faith comes, and they walk away from faith. To move past that wall is to what they talk about, the inward journey, right? Where you start examining the brokenness in the brokenness in me, and it becomes a greater, deeper understanding of how complex the world is, how broken the world is, and how broken I am. And working towards that healing is what gets you past the wall. Yeah. And what you end up with is more of an open-ended paradigm, like we've been talking about, an open-ended paradigm where it's not just, it's this one framework of God that I'm ascribed to. I'm more open to the ways that God is leading in different ways in my life, in other people's lives. But it only comes, it's a faith, but it's a different type of faith at that point, because it's not a faith to a certain system. It's a faith to, man, God is rich and big, and I don't completely understand him. And there's still questions that I hold, and I don't fully understand everything, but he has shown me enough that I want to follow him.
Yeah.
And that leads to that deeper place that Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others like Mother Teresa and others that like them have gotten to.
Yeah, Lawrence Kohlberg, the famous sociologist of religion, says that is the mystical state. And he calls it the state of universalizing faith, and that is that your belief in whatever it is that you believe. For us Christians, it's God and his son Jesus Christ, but you believe in that transcends everything else. And that's a hard place to get, because it forgoes any other it forgoes any paradigm. Now you call it open-ended, might be non-existent. It just focuses on people. And that, I think, is the belief that blesses. So the Mother Teresas of the world, and the Bonhoeffers of the world, and the Jesuses of the world, that's the space that they live in. Joey, can you pray as we finish?
Yes. Our good and gracious God, we want to thank you for being a God who seeks us, who is willing to work through the questions and struggles that we have. But most of all, for being a God who gives us the grace to have those questions and struggles, and is willing to move with us through that journey. None of these people we've talked about today had a perfect faith, a complete faith. And yet each of them you were willing to have a conversation with move to work through. Even Pilate, who was judging you were willing to have that conversation with him to help to try to grow his understanding of who you are. Thank you for being that God for us, and help us to follow in those same footsteps with others and with you, as our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
So may you be blessed, and may you have a faith that transcends. That is our prayer for you. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.